Hey, what's up everybody? This is Isaiah from Player Development, and this is our follow-up to our initial interview on the transgender debate, whether transgender athletes should compete according to their assigned gender identity at birth or with the gender that they identify with. What happened was I got a lot of feedback on that first video, and you can go to the link in the description to check out that initial interview. That was with Dr. McKinney, a gender studies professor at the College of William & Mary. There was a lot of commentary, a lot of disagreement with the stances that she took, the arguments that she made. What I felt like was a difficulty was that a lot of people are talking about biology, like it's about genetics and testosterone, and I felt like the arguments that I heard in that initial interview were not as strong in that regard. What I tried to do was line up another interview with somebody who was in the field of endocrinology or biology or medicine. Nobody was willing to go on camera and talk about this topic. What I found out was that people are concerned for their job security, maybe even their safety in some cases, but the fear that whatever they might say does not line up exactly with what the wider culture wants the narrative to be. So that being said, I would have loved to have an expert lined up to talk about all these questions that people are raising. The best I can offer right now is having looked at some of the studies myself, having watched some more videos myself, and just really raising the questions that come to mind for me as a layperson thinking through some of these topics. Comment below what your thoughts are going into this discussion, and then also what you think afterwards. Maybe if you have some expertise in the field, drop a comment below and let me know, hey, this is a stupid question and this is why. Or if you have some answers for me based on some of the questions that I'm about to ask, please enlighten me. That being said, I'm not coming into this as an apologist for either side, and maybe my mark of success is equally pissing off people from both sides of the debate. But look, even with all that preface and with that intro, if you're still with me and you're willing to go on this journey with me, drop a like and subscribe. That helps our channel to continue making the content that we're making, tackling hard questions with an honest mindset and trying to come at things fairly as much as possible. Okay, so first thing I want to get into is some kind of hypothetical questions and looking at some of the arguments on both sides ideologically. So before we get into any of the biological stuff, just some of the arguments that I'm hearing from left or right about transgender athletes competing according to their gender identity. Okay, so one prevailing narrative, especially from the left over these past couple years, has been all about follow the science, follow the research, right? We're science-based, we're evidence-based. And that was especially true during COVID. Like, hey, just listen to what the researchers are saying. And I think my question about that is, if that is the case, why does it seem that researchers feel disempowered to talk about their findings when it comes to biology and endocrinology, and about their research when it comes to transgender athletes, and about how hormonal treatments and anything about transgender athletes, they seem really disinclined to publicize? I just raise that as a question because I honestly don't know. In theory, if we are just following the science, researchers should be the ones that are at the forefront saying, hey, this is what research tells us, so this is how we should organize sports around that, organize our categories around that. And it seems like these researchers seem to be more in fear of having their findings not match up with what people want the findings to be. And on the conservative side, the right-leaning side, what I hear most about is this failed male athlete narrative. The sense I'm getting is, okay, I am a male athlete and I just could not make it in my sport. I was not good enough. So I'm going to decide that I'm transgender and I'll go into the women's competitions and it'll be so much easier. I won't have to work as hard and I'll be able to get the success that I've always craved. I have a couple of problems with this narrative, because that assumes that somebody cares so much about winning that they're willing to undergo years of hormone therapy, dramatically change how their body works and feels, willingly put themselves in a minority group that historically suffers from oppression and highly increased risk of mental health disorders for the chance at, I don't know, prize money, fame. It doesn't seem to add up for me. I think we also need to remember in this narrative that it's not just, oh, I become a woman and I'll automatically become an elite female athlete. I can't just identify as a woman today and go out for the WNBA the next day. There's no chance. This is not just any average man declares himself a woman and then suddenly they're at the top of the female athletic competition. I think, as we talk about people like Leah Thomas, when she identified as male, already competing in NCAA men's swimming, by that metric, was one of the top swimmers in the country, whether or not she was the best swimmer in men's swimming. So it's not just random dude who couldn't make it on the men's swim team. And I think that really disrespects the work that female athletes put in, or any athlete puts in, to become proficient at their sport, to just say, oh, well, if you're a male, you will automatically win because you're male. Or if you had that higher exposure to testosterone, you'll automatically win or automatically have an edge and don't have to work as hard because you were male. So I think my problem with that is labeling this as a failed athlete narrative is very diminishing to everyone involved in the world of sports and shows a very shallow understanding of what makes somebody good and proficient at a particular sport. So let's dig into some of my questions about kind of the more biological and hormonal aspect of trans athletes. So stick with me, we're going to get into some statistics, we're going to get into some studies. Again, this is not my field of expertise, so I apologize in advance for any mistakes, any misinterpretations. Feel free to correct me in the comments. From what my understanding is, testosterone seems to be the main point of contention. So some background, testosterone is an androgen. It is what might be considered a male hormone in that it is more prevalent in men. It is naturally produced by both cis men and cis women, but in higher concentrations in cis men compared to cis women on average. The level that one of the studies that I looked at talks about circulating testosterone, the amount of testosterone circulating throughout the system, right off the bat, is that is not a stable level. Testosterone will fluctuate before, during, and after a competition. At the prospect of competing, some people's testosterone will naturally spike. Obviously, during training or during the competition, testosterone will also increase. And this was something interesting. After a competition, whether you won or you lost, testosterone might increase or decrease. In certain people, they would experience an increase in testosterone when they won and experience a decrease when they lost. And so I think that may indicate that we need to look at a chicken or an egg situation here. Is it that you won because you have a higher level of testosterone that might lead to increased performance? Or do you have a higher level of testosterone because you won, or because you were training, and because you were wired to compete? And the 2018 study noted that there was a dose-response relationship between testosterone in the system and increase in muscle mass and strength. If I'm remembering my stats class correctly, that as you increase level of testosterone in somebody's system, there's a corresponding increase in muscle mass and strength. That is helpful because that is a lot less nebulous of a term than athletic performance. Because as any athlete knows, that is very hard to capture what we mean when we say something like performance. Something measurable like muscle mass or strength, that is something that we can measure and say, okay, testosterone affects these factors that may go into athletics. Does not necessarily predict performance or success. Final note of preface before we jump into some of these questions that I have about testosterone in the system and trans athletes, all that kind of stuff. There's also a distinction considered between endogenous androgens or testosterone and exogenous. So endogenous meaning, we can say naturally occurring, what you are born with without any interference, without any alteration, shall we say. So this would be someone who maybe has a naturally high or naturally low level of testosterone, whether you're cis man, cis woman, trans man, trans woman. There are also exogenous sources of testosterone, and these are introduced externally to the system. You can think of this as exogenous testosterone is banned in most competitions as doping. So that brings me to my first question, is there a difference in the effects on somebody's body between endogenous testosterone versus exogenous testosterone? Let's say you have two athletes, one who has naturally high testosterone, one who has naturally low. Does that inborn innate difference predict some level of difference in performance? But is there a difference between the effects of what you are born with in terms of testosterone and what is introduced externally into your system? And one of the videos that I was watching, this was with Trevor Noah and Veronica Ivy, who is an Olympic athlete, if I recall correctly. But she was on a show talking about trans athletes on this topic especially, and she said there was a study that indicated there is no relationship between the level of endogenous testosterone and sports performance. So basically she was saying innate or inborn unaltered level of testosterone is not a predictor of how athletic or how well you would perform in sports. She did not cite the study. I don't know who the authors of that study are, and I didn't get a chance to look at it myself. So I'm taking her word for it for the findings. That may be relevant in our discussion later. Okay, so question 2. This is about the puberty question. So the conservative side tend to say, if you've been through puberty as a male and had access to that testosterone and that growth in height and muscle mass and strength during those however many years of puberty, then no matter what happens later on, you keep those advantages with you, and that makes things unfair. So my question is, if someone were to transition after puberty, or maybe around 18 years old when they've been exposed to that endogenous testosterone, that increased level of testosterone, for a significant amount of years, and then you go through hormone therapy, if you go through that hormone therapy and then compete again, how does the hormone therapy, which includes testosterone blockers and introduction of estrogen into the system, how does that impact the so-called advantages of that exposure to testosterone? How does that impact muscle mass, strength, those factors that the study actually identified as testosterone having an effect on? And then as a corollary to that, how long does any advantage or disadvantage persist? So question 3, I really don't know, and I want to learn, and I want somebody who with expertise to tell me what's going on with these questions. But what is the functional difference, if there's any way we can measure that? What is the functional difference between a trans woman who was exposed to testosterone during puberty, maybe they transitioned after they turned 18, so they had that level of testosterone in their system for a good while before transitioning and going through hormonal treatment. What is the difference, if any, between that athlete versus a cis woman who has a naturally high, and maybe we might say outside of normal range, high levels of testosterone? Because those women do exist. That can be a side effect or trait of someone with polycystic ovary syndrome, and that those athletes do tend to be highly represented at the elite levels. So the 2018 study that I looked at actually proposed a certain cutoff of a level of testosterone in somebody's system that would determine whether they should compete in males sports or women's sports. The authors actually noted that their proposed cutoff would exclude women with untreated hyperandrogenism. My reading of that would mean that if a cis woman has naturally high levels of androgens in their system, testosterone, the author's proposed cutoff would actually exclude those cis women from competing in women's sports. That leads me to that question. What's the difference between a trans woman who maybe has had historical exposure to high levels of testosterone and a cis woman who is born with naturally high levels of testosterone? So question number 4, and I don't know how you would begin to answer this, but the assumption is more testosterone equals better performance. My question is, statistically, how much of improvement in performance, whether you measure that by race times, 1 rep maxes and lifts, or scoring average, speed, whatever, how much of that is attributable to increased testosterone in somebody's system? Basically, if you were to remove all the other advantages of training, access to medical care, access to healthy food, mindset, socialization to compete, what would be left? How much is actually attributed only to the level of testosterone in someone's system? And I think that if we could find some way to figure that out, that might help answer the question of, is this fair, unfair? Is it a non-issue? So those are my questions. Again, if you have any questions or feedback of your own, drop them in the comments. Subscribe if you made it this far, because man, we're in this together. We're trying to figure this out, and there are no easy answers. I think that's the most difficult part right now, is that everyone wants to distill it down to like, oh well, if this, then that. And it's a simple, easy answer. But it affects too many people, and people by themselves are too complicated to be reduced to something as simple as a cutoff of testosterone level. If you're higher than this, you compete in men's. If you're lower than this, you compete in women's. People are just not that simple. A couple of things I'll say is that absolutely trans athletes have a right to play sports. I don't know what the most just, most fair, whatever system would look like. I'll make the point again that anyone who watches sports and is honest about it to themselves knows that physical advantage and physical potential does not necessarily equal success in sports. We've seen too many athletes who were drafted based on like potential, strength, and athleticism that didn't pan out. There are tons of stories just in the NBA. And if body and testosterone and hormones were all that mattered, if the physical potential were all that mattered in sports, the combine would be the best predictor of who would be successful in the NBA and the NFL from year to year. And we know that that's not true. It's not just about raw athleticism when it comes to sports. I think that's one of the things we love about sports, is that it's not just the most gifted person who's going to win each time. There's hard work, there's grit, there's dedication, there's practice, all the stuff behind the scenes. There's mental toughness that is so much bigger than just what testosterone might provide for somebody. Thanks for joining me on this conversation. Again, appreciate your feedback. Leave comments below. Continue the discussion. Let's continue having conversations to make sports a better world for everybody.